Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Okay, welcome for the reading. We're, of course, reading the next chapter of Comrade Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds. So now we've learned about the overthrow of USSR. We've learned about what people's experiences and opinions is, both on the ground and in official positions. And now we are going to take what we've learned and ask, so does all of this mean the overthrow of socialism in USSR? Does this mean the end of Marxism? With chapter 8, the end of Marxism? Some people say that Marxism is a science, and others say it is a dogma, a bundle of reductionist, unscientific claims. I would suggest that Marxism is not a science in the positive sense, formulating hypotheses and testing for predictability, but more accurately a social science, one that shows us how to conceptualize systematically and systemically, moving from surface appearances to deeper, broader features. So better to understand both the specific and the general, and the relationship between the two. Marxism has an explanatory power that is superior to mainstream bourgeois social science, because it deals with the imperatives of class power and political economy, the motor forces of society and history. The class basis of political economy is not a subject for which mainstream social science has much understanding or tolerance. In 1915, Lenin wrote that, quote, bourgeois science will not even hear of Marxism, declaring that it has been refuted and annihilated. Marx is attacked with equal zest by young scholars who are making a career by refuting socialism, and by decrepit elders who are preserving the tradition of all kinds of outworn systems, unquote. Lenin. Over 80 years later, the careerist scholars are still declaring Marxism to have been proven wrong once and for all. As the anti-communist liberal writer Irving Howe puts it, quote, the simplistic formulae of textbooks, including the Marxist ones, no longer hold. That is why some of us don't regard ourselves as Marxists, unquote. Newsday, 4/21/1986. Here, I want to argue that Marxism is not outmoded or simplistic, only the image of it entertained by anti-Marxists like Howe. Some durable basics. With the overthrow of communist governments in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, announcements about the moribund nature of Marxist dogma poured forth with renewed vigor. But Marx's major work was Capital, a study not of existing socialism, which actually did not exist in his day, but of capitalism, a subject that remains terribly relevant to our lives. Hey Barry, welcome in. It would make more sense to declare Marxism obsolete if and when capitalism is abolished, rather than socialism. I wish to argue not merely that Marx is still relevant, but that he is more relevant today than he was in the 19th century. that the forces of capitalist motion and development are operating with greater scope than when he first studied them. This is not to say that everything Marx and Engels anticipated has come true. Their work was not a perfect prophecy, but an imperfect, incomplete science, like all sciences, directed towards understanding a capitalism that leaves its bloody footprints upon the world as never before. Some of Marxism's basic postulates are as follows. In order to live, human beings must produce. People cannot live by bread alone, but neither can they live without bread. This does not mean all human activity can be reduced to material motives, but that all activity is linked to a material base. A work of art may have no direct economic motive attached to it, yet its creation would be impossible if there did not exist the material conditions that allowed the artist to create and show the work to interested audiences who have the time for art. What people need for survival is found in nature, but rarely in a form suitable for immediate consumption. Labor, therefore, becomes a primary condition of human existence. But labor is more than a way of providing for survival. It is one of the means whereby people develop their material and cultural life, acquiring knowledge and new modes of social organization. The conflicting class interests that evolve around the productive forces shape the development of a social system. When we speak of early horticultural societies, or of slave or feudal or mercantile or industrial capitalist societies, we are recognizing how the basic economic relations leave a defining stamp on a given social order. Capitalist theorists present capital as a creative providential force. As they would have it, capital gives shape and opportunity to labor. Capital creates production jobs, new technologies, and a general prosperity. Marxists turn the equation around. They argue that, of itself, capital cannot produce anything. It is the thing that is produced by labor. Only human labor can create the farm and the factory, the machine and the computer. And in a class society, the wealth so produced by many is accumulated in the hands of relatively few, who soon translate their economic power into political and cultural power in order to better secure the exploitative social order that so favors them. I don't know, Barry. We might have to go all candy tomorrow, because I still have so much content. The standard trickle-down theory says that the accumulation of wealth at the top eventually brings more prosperity to the rest of us below. A rising tide lifts all boats. I would argue that in a class society, the accumulation of wealth fosters the spread of poverty. The wealthy few live off the backs of the impoverished many. There can be no rich slaveholders living in idle comfort without a mass of penniless slaves to support their luxurious lifestyles. No lords of the manor who live in opulence without a mass of impoverished landless serfs who till the lord's land from dawn to dusk. So too, under capitalism, there can be no financial moguls and industrial tycoons without millions of underpaid and overworked employees. Exploitation can be measured not only in paltry wages, but in the disparity between the wealth created by the worker and the pay she or he receives. Thus, some professional athletes receive dramatically higher salaries than most people. But compared to the enormous wealth they produce for their owners, and taking into account the rigors and relative brevity of their careers, the injuries sustained, and the lack of lifelong benefits, it can be said they are exploited at a far higher rate than most workers. Conservative ideologues defend capitalism as a system that preserves culture, traditional values, the family, and community. Marxists would respond that capitalism has done more to undermine such things than any other system in history, given its wars, colonizations, and forced migrations. Its enclosures, evictions, poverty wages, child labor, homelessness, underemployment, crime, drug infestation, and urban squalor. All over the world, community in the broader sense, the Gemeinschaft with its organic social relationships and strong reciprocal bonds of commonality and kinship, is forcibly transformed by global capital into commercialized, atomized, mass market societies. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels referred to capitalism's implacable drive to settle, quote, over the whole surface of the globe, creating a world after its own image, unquote. Gemeinschaft, thank you, thank you. No system in history has been more relentless in battering down ancient and fragile cultures, pulverizing centuries old practices in a matter of years, devouring the resources of whole regions, and standardizing varieties of human experience. Big capital has no commitment to anything but capital accumulation, no loyalty to any nation, culture, or people. It moves inexorably according to its inner imperative to accumulate at the highest possible rate without concern for human and environmental costs. It means kinship. Thank you, Radisby, and comrades who helped me pronounce it correctly. The first law of the market is to make the largest possible profit from people's labor. Private profitability, rather than human need, is the determining condition of private investment. There prevails a rational systemization of human endeavor in pursuit of a socially irrational end. Quote, accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. More right than wrong. Those who reject Marx frequently contend that his predictions about proletariat revolution have proven wrong. From this, they conclude that his analysis of the nature of capitalism and imperialism must also be wrong. But we should distinguish between Marx, the childistic thinker, who made grandly optimistic predictions about the flowering of the human condition, and Marx, the economist and social scientist, who provided us with fundamental insights into capitalist society that have held painfully true to the present day. Looking at all of those who quote Marx letter to fucking Lincoln or whatever the fuck. Right? That's an expression of thinking dogmatically and thinking dogmatically with Marxism and not being able to separate the science of Marxism from Marx's opinions and dealing and conversations with others at the time without being able to put that in the historical context, which you should always consider whatever Marx work you're reading or Lenin or Mao. you should always consider the historical context in which it is writing in, and even maybe if you're not familiar with what was going on in that place at that time, just getting a little basic better understanding of it can even help contextualize what they're talking about. The latter Marx has been regularly misrepresented by anti-Marxist writers. Consider the following predictions. Business cycles and the tendency towards recession. Marx noted that something more than greed is involved in the capitalist's relentless pursuit of profit. Given the pressures of competition and rising wages, capitalists must make technological innovations to increase their productivity and diminish their labor costs. This creates problems of its own. The more capital goods, such as machinery, plants, technologies, fuel, needed for production, the higher the fixed costs, and the greater the pressure to increase productivity to maintain profit margins. This is a good note here, too. As an industry becomes more capital intensive, proportionately more money must be invested to generate a given number of jobs. But business is not dedicated to creating jobs. In fact, capitalists are constantly devising ways to downsize the workforce. From 1980 to 1990, the net number of jobs created by the biggest corporations in the United States, the Fortune 500, was zero. The new jobs of that period came mostly from less capital intensive smaller firms, light industry, service industry, and the public sector. A good footnote. Since workers are not paid enough to buy back the goods and services they produce, Marx noted there is always the problem of a disparity between mass production and aggregate demand. If demand slackens, owners cut back on production and investment. Even when there is ample demand, they are tempted to downsize the workforce and intensify the rate of exploitation of the remaining employees, seizing any opportunity to reduce benefits and wages. The ensuing drop in the workforce's buying power leads to a further decline in demand and to business recessions that inflict the greatest pain on those with the least assets. Marx foresaw this tendency for profits to fall and for protracted recessions and economic instability. As the economist Robert Heilbronner noted, this was an extraordinary prediction, for in Marx's day, economists did not recognize boom and bust business cycles as inherent to the capitalist system. But today we know that recessions are a chronic condition, and as Marx also predicted, they have become international in scope. Okay. Have a good evening, Ree. Thanks for hanging out, comrade. Capital concentration. When the Communist Manifesto first appeared in 1848, bigness was the exception rather than the norm. Yet, Marx predicted that large firms would force out or buy up smaller adversaries and increasingly dominate the business world. As capital became more concentrated, this was not the as capital became more concentrated, This was not the accepted wisdom of the day, and must have sounded improbable to those who gave it any attention. But it has come to pass. Indeed, the rate of mergers and takeovers has been higher in the 1980s and 90s than at any other time in the history of capitalism. Growth of the proletariat. Another of Marx's predictions is that the proletariat, workers who have no tools of their own and must work for wages or salaries, selling their labor to someone else, would become an ever greater percentage of the workforce. In 1820, about 75% of Americans worked for themselves on farms or in small businesses and artisan crafts. By 1940, that number had dropped to 21.6%. Today, less than 10% of the labor force is self employed. The same shift in the workforce can be observed in the Third World. From 1970 to 1980, the number of wage workers in Asia and Africa increased by almost two-thirds, from 72 million to 120 million. The tendency toward the steady growth of the working class, both industrial and service workers, and as Marx predicted, this is happening globally in every land upon which capitalism descends. Proletarian Revolution. As capitalism develops, so will the proletariat, Marx predicted. We have seen that to be true. But he went further. With the growing misery and polarization, the masses would eventually rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie and put the means of production under public ownership for the benefit of all. The revolution would come in the more industrialized capitalist countries that had large, developed working classes. What struck Marx about the working class was its level of organization and consciousness. Unlike previously oppressed classes, the proletariat, heavily concentrated in urban areas, seemed capable of an unparalleled level of political development. It would not only rebel against its oppressors, as had slaves and serfs, but would create an egalitarian, non-exploitative social order as never before seen in history. In his day, Marx saw an alternative system emerging in the clubs, mutual aid societies, political organizations, and newspapers of a rapidly growing British working class. For the first time, history would be made by the masses, in a conscious way, a class for itself. Sporadic rebellion would be replaced by class-conscious revolution. Instead of burning down the manor, the workers would expropriate it and put it to use for the collective benefit of the common people, the ones who built it in the first place. Certainly, Marx's predictions about revolution have not materialized. There has been no successful proletariat revolution in an advanced capitalist society. As working class developed, so did the capitalist state, whose function has been to protect the capitalist class with the mechanisms of police suppression and its informational and cultural hegemony. Of itself, class struggle does not bring inevitable proletarian victory, or even a proletarian uprising. Oppressive social conditions may cry out for revolution, but that does not mean revolution is forthcoming. This point is still not understood by some present-day leftists. In his later years, Marx himself began to entertain doubts about the inevitability of a victorious workers' revolution. So far, the prevailing force has not been revolution, but counter-revolution. The devilish destruction wreaked by capitalist states upon popular struggles at the cost of millions of lives. Marx also underestimated the extent to which the advanced capitalist state could use its wealth and power to create a variety of institutions that restrict and distract popular consciousness or blunt discontent through reform programs. Hey, not to interrupt the reading, but I'm hoping to start posting some news videos on in the future regarding both Juche and DPRK topics after theory reading. Yeah, yes, please do. Drop it in the Rouge. If you drop that in the content suggestions of the Discord, I won't get lost in chat as easy while I finish up the read. Contrary to his expectations, successful revolutions occurred in less developed, largely peasant societies such as Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam. Although the proletariats in those countries participated, and sometimes, as in the case of Russia in 1917, even spearheaded the insurgency. Although Marx's prediction about revolution have not materialized as he envisioned, in recent years there have been impressive instances of working class militancy in South Korea, South Africa, Argentina, Italy, France, Germany, Great Britain, and dozens of other countries, including even the United States. Such mass struggles usually go unreported in the corporate media. In 1984 to 85 in Great Britain, a bitter, year-long strike resulted in some 10,500 coal miners being arrested, 6,500 injured or battered, and 11 killed. For the British miners locked in that conflict, class struggle was something more than a quaint, obsolete concept. So in other countries, in Nicaragua, a mass uprising brought down the hated Somoza dictatorship. In Brazil in 1980 to 83, as Peter Worsley observes, quote, the Brazilian working class has played precisely the role assigned to it in 19th century Marxist theory, paralyzing Sao Paulo in a succession of enormous mass strikes that began over bread and butter issues, but which in the end forced the military to make major political concessions, notably the restoration of a measure of authentic party political life. Revolutions are relatively rare occurrences, but popular struggle is a widespread and constant phenomenon. More wealth, more poverty. Marx believed that as wealth becomes more concentrated, poverty will become more widespread, and the plight of working people ever more desperate. According to his critics, this prediction has proven wrong. They point out that he wrote during the time of the raw industrialism, an era of robber barons and the 14-hour workday. Through persistent struggle, the working class improved its life conditions from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. Today, mainstream spokespersons portray the United States as a prosperous middle-class society. Yet, one might wonder, during the Reagan-Bush-Clinton era, from 1981 to 1996, the share of the national income that went to those who work for a living shrank by over 12%. The share that went to those who live off investments increased almost 35%. Less than 1% of the population owns almost 50% of the nation's wealth. The richest families are hundreds of times wealthier than the average household, in the lower 90% of the population. The gap between America's rich and poor is greater than it has been in more than half a century and is getting ever greater. Thus, between 1977 and 1989, the top 1% saw their earnings grow by over 100%, while the three lowest quintiles averaged a 3 to 10% drop in real income. The New York Times, 6/20/1996, reported that income disparity in 1995, quote, was wider than it has been since the end of World War II, unquote. The average income for the top 20% jumped 44%, from 73,754 to 105,945 between 1968 and 1994, while the bottom 20% had a 7% increase from 7,202 to 7,762, or only 560 in constant dollars. But these figures understate the problem. The Times story is based on a consensus Bureau study that fails to report the income of the very rich. For years, the reportable upper limit was $300,000 yearly income. In 1994, the Bureau lifted the allowable limit to $1 million. This still leaves out the richest 1%, the hundreds of billionaires and thousands of multimillionaires who make many times more than $1 million a year. The really big money is concentrated in a portion of the population so minuscule as to be judged statistically insignificant. But despite their tiny numbers, the amount of wealth they control is enormous and bespeaks an income disparity 1,000 times greater than the spread allowed by the Census Bureau figures. Thus, the difference between a multi-billionaire who might make $100 million in any one year and a janitor who makes $8,000 is not 14 to 1, the usually reported spread between highest and lowest, but over 14,000 to 1. Yet the highest incomes remain unreported and uncounted. In a word, most studies of this sort give us no idea of how rich the very rich really are. The number living below the poverty level in the United States climbed from 24 million in 1977 to over 35 million by 1995. People were falling more deeply into poverty than in earlier times and finding it increasingly difficult to emerge from it. In addition, various diseases related to hunger and poverty have been on the rise. There has been a general downgrading of the workforce. Regular employment is being replaced by contracted labor or temporary help, resulting in lower wages with fewer or no benefits. Many unions have been destroyed or seriously weakened. Protective government regulations are being rolled back or left unenforced. And there has been an increase in speed ups, injuries, and other workplace abuses. By the 1990s, the growing impoverishment of middle and working classes, including small independent producers, was becoming evident in various countries. In 20 years, more than half the farmers in industrialized countries, some 22 million, were ruined. Meanwhile, as noted in the previous two chapters, free market reforms have brought a dramatic increase in poverty, hunger, crime, and ill health, along with a growth of large fortunes for the very few in the former communist countries. The Third World has endured deepening impoverishment over the last half century. As foreign investment has increased, so has the misery of the common people who are driven from the land. Those who manage to find employment in the cities are forced to labor for subsistence wages. We might recall how enclosure acts of the late 18th century in England fenced off common lands and drove the peasantry into the industrial hellholes of Manchester and London, transforming them into beggars or half-starved factory workers. Enclosure continues throughout the Third World, displacing tens of millions of people. In countries like Argentina, Venezuela, and Peru, per capita income was lower in 1990 than it has been 20 years earlier. In Mexico, workers earned 50% less in 1995 than in 1980. 1/3 of Latin America's population, some 130 million, live in utter destitution, while tens of millions more barely manage. In Brazil, the purchasing power of the lower income brackets declined by 50% between 1940 and 1990, and at least half the population suffered varying degrees of malnutrition. In much of Africa, misery and hunger have assumed horrendous proportions. In Zaire, 80% of the people live in absolute penury. In Asia and Africa, more than 40% of the population linger at the starvation level. Marx predicted that an expanding capitalism would bring greater wealth for the few and growing misery for the many. That seems to be what is happening, and on a global scale. A holistic science. Repeatedly dismissed as an obsolete doctrine, Marxism retains a compelling contemporary quality, for it is less a body of fixed dicta and more a method of looking beyond immediate appearances to see the inner qualities and moving forces that shape social relations and much of history itself. As Marx noted, quote, all science would be superfluous if outward appearances and the essence of things directly coincided, unquote. Indeed, perhaps the reason so much of modern social science seems superfluous is because it settles for the tedious tracing of outward appearances. To understand capitalism, one first has to strip away the appearances presented by its ideology. Unlike most bourgeois theorists, Marx realized that what capitalism claims to be and what it actually is are two different things. What is unique about capitalism is that the systematic expropriation of labor for the sole purpose of accumulation. Capital annexes living labor in order to accumulate more capital. The ultimate purpose of work is not to perform services for consumers or sustain life and society, but to make more and more money for the investor, irrespective of the human and environmental costs. An essential point of Marxist analysis is that the social structure and class order prefigure our behavior in many ways. Capitalism moves into every area of work and community, harnessing all of social life to its pursuit of profit. It converts nature, labor, science, art, music, and medicine into commodities, and commodities into capital. It transforms land into real estate, folk culture into mass culture, and citizens into debt-ridden workers and consumers. Marxists understand that a class society is not just a divided society, but one ruled by class power, with the state playing the crucial role in maintaining the existing class structure. Marxism might be considered a holistic science, in that it recognizes the links between various components of the social system. Capitalism is not just an economic system, but a political and cultural one as well. An entire social order. When we study any part of that order, be it the news or entertainment media, criminal justice, Congress, defense spending, overseas military intervention, intelligence agencies, campaign finance, science and technology, education, medical care, taxation, transportation, housing, or whatever, we will see how the particular part reflects the nature of the whole. Its unique dynamic often buttresses and is shaped by the larger social system, especially the system's overriding need to maintain the prerogatives of the corporate class. In keeping with their system's sustaining function, the major news media present reality as a scatter of events and subjects that ostensibly bear little relation to each other or to a larger set of social relations. Consider a specific phenomenon like racism. Racism is presented as essentially a set of bad attitudes held by racists. There is little analysis of what makes it so functional for a class society. Instead, race and class are treated as mutually exclusive concepts in competition with each other. but those who have an understanding of class power know that as class contradictions deepen and come to the fore, racism becomes not less, but more important as a factor in class conflict. In short, both race and class are likely to be crucial arenas of struggle at the very same time. Marxists further maintain that racism involves not just personal attitude, but institutional structure and systemic power. They point out that racist organizations and sentiments are often propagated by well financed reactionary forces seeking to divide the working populace against itself, fracturing it into antagonistic ethnic enclaves. Marxists also point out that racism is used as a means of depressing wages by keeping a segment of the labor force vulnerable to super exploitation. To see racism in the larger context of corporate society is to move from a liberal complaint to a radical analysis. Instead of thinking that racism is an irrational output of a basically rational and benign system, we should see it as the rational output of a basically irrational and unjust system. By rational, I mean purposive, and functional in sustaining the system that nurtures it. Lacking a holistic approach to society, conventional social science tends to compartmentalize social experience. So we are asked to ponder whether this or that phenomenon is cultural or economic or psychological, when usually it is a blend of all of these things. Thus, an automobile is unmistakably an economic artifact, but it also has a cultural and psychological component, and even an aesthetic dimension. We need a greater sense of how analytically distinct phenomena are, often empirically interrelated, and may actually gather strength and definition from each other. Marxists do not accept the prevalent view of institutions as just being there, with all the natural innocence of mountains. Especially the more articulated formal institutions, such as the church, army, police, military, university, media, medicine, and the like. Institutions are heavily shaped by class interests and class power. Far from being neutral and independent bastions, the major institutions of society are tied to the big business class. Corporate representatives exercise direct decision making power through control of governing boards and directorships. Business elites usually control the budgets and the very property of various institutions. A control inscribed into law through corporate charters and enforced by the police powers of the state. Their power extends to the managers picked, the policy set, and the performances of the employees. If conventional social science has any one dedication, it is to ignore the linkages between social action and systemic demands of capitalism, avoiding any view of power in its class dimension, and any view of class as a power relationship. For conventional researchers, power is seen as fragmented and fluid, and class is nothing more than an occupational or income category, to be correlated with voting habits, consumer styles, or whatever, and not as a relationship between those who own and those who labor for those who own. I'm almost done this chapter. In the Marxist view, there can be no such thing as a class as such, a social entity unto itself. There can be no lords without serfs, no masters without slaves, no capitalists without workers. More than just a sociological category, class is a relationship to the means of production and to social and state power. This idea, so fundamental to an understanding of public policy, is avoided by conventional social scientists who prefer to concentrate on everything else but class power realities. It is remarkable, for instance, that some political scientists have studied the presidency and Congress for decades without uttering a word about capitalism, without so much as a sidelong glance at how the imperatives of a capitalist politico economic order play such a crucial role in prefiguring the political agenda. Social science is cluttered with community power studies that treat communities and issues as isolated, autonomous entities. Such investigations are usually limited to the immediate interplay of policy actors, with little said about how issues link up to a larger range of social interests. Conservative ideological preconceptions regularly influence the research strategies of the most social scientists and policy analysts in political science. For instance, 1. The relationship between industrial capitalist nations and third world nations are described as A. Dependency and interdependency, and as fostering a mutually beneficial development rather than B. An imperialism that exploits the land, labor, and resources of weaker nations for the benefit of the favored classes in both the industrial and less developed worlds. Valkyrie, thank you. Welcome in. Just finishing up this chapter, Blackshirts and Reds. Hey, Godsdam, welcome in, comrade. So great to see you. Everybody follow our comrade Valkyrie, please. We're just reading this part. We're just finishing up this last part of Blackshirts and Reds, this chapter anyway. We've got one chapter left after this. So welcome in, everybody. I'll just start here again for y'all, okay? It is a great book. Everybody follow Valkyrie, please. 1. I'll start right here again. Conservative ideological preconceptions regularly influence the research strategies of most social scientists and policy analysts. In political science, for instance, 1. The relationships between industrial capitalist nations and third world nations are described as A. Dependency and interdependency, and as fostering a mutually beneficial development, rather than B. An imperialism that exploits the land, labor, and resources of weaker nations for the benefit of the favored classes in both the industrial and less developed worlds. 2. The United States and other democratic capitalist societies are said to be held together by A. Common values that reflect the common interests, not by B. Class power and domination. 3. The fragmentation of power in the political process is supposedly indicative of A. A fluidity and democratization of interest group pluralism rather than B. The pocketing and structuring of power in an unaccountable and undemocratic ways. Yeah, it's a pop quiz. 4. The mass propagation of conventional political beliefs is described as A. Political socialization and education for citizenship, and is treated as a desirable civic process, rather than B. An indoctrination that distorts the information flow and warps the public's critical perceptions. In each of these instances, mainstream academics offer a version not as research findings, but as a priori assumption that requires no critical analysis upon which research is then predicated. At the same time, they disregard the evidence and research that supports version B. By ignoring the dominant class conditions that exercise such an influence over social behavior, conventional social science can settle on surface factualness, trying to explain immediate actions in exclusively immediate terms. Such an approach places a high priority on epiphenomenal and idiosyncratic explanations, the peculiarities of specific personalities and situations. What is habitually overlooked in such research, and in our news reports and daily observations, and sometimes even our political struggles, is the way seemingly remote forces may prefigure our experiences. Learning to ask why. When we think without Marxist perspective, that is, without considering class interest and class power, we seldom ask why certain things happen. Many things are reported in the news, but few are explained. Little is said about how the social order is organized and whose interests prevail. Devoid of a framework that explains why things happen, we are left to see the world as do mainstream media pundits, as a flow of events, a scatter of particular developments and personalities unrelated to a larger set of social relations, propelled by happenstance, circumstance, confused intentions, and individual ambition, never by powerful class interests. And yet producing effects that serve such interests with impressive regularity. Thus, we fail to associate social problems with the socio-economic forces that create them, and we learn to truncate our own critical thinking. Imagine if we attempted something different. For example, we try to explain that wealth and poverty exist together, not in accidental juxtaposition, but because wealth causes poverty, an inevitable outcome of economic exploitation both at home and abroad. How could such an analysis gain any exposure in the capitalist media or in the mainstream political life? Suppose we started with a particular story about how child labor in Indonesia is contracted by multinational corporations at near starvation wage levels. This information would not be carried in right wing publications, but in 1996 it did appear after decades of efforts by some activists in the centrist mainstream press. What if we then crossed a line and said that these exploitative employer-employee relations were backed by the full might of the Indonesian military government? Fewer media would carry this story, but it still might get mentioned in an inside page of New York Times or Washington Post. Then suppose we crossed another line and said that these repressive arrangements would not prevail were it not for generous military aid from the United States, and that for almost 30 years the homicidal Indonesian military has been financed, armed, advised, and trained by the US national security state. Such a story would be even more unlikely to appear in the liberal press, but it is still issue specific and safely without an overall class analysis. So, it might well make its way onto left liberal opinion publications like The Nation and The Progressive, or today, NPR, or Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. I'm Amy Goodman. Now, suppose we pointed out that the conditions found in Indonesia, the heartless economic exploitation, brutal military repression, and lavish US support exist in scores of other countries. Suppose we then cross the most serious line of all, and instead of just deploring this fact, we also asked why successive US administrations involved themselves in such unsavory pursuits throughout the world. And what if then we tried to explain that the whole phenomenon is consistent with the US dedication to making the world safe for the free market and giant multinational corporations, and that the intended goals are A, to maximize opportunities to accumulate wealth by depressing the wage levels of workers throughout the world and preventing them from organizing on behalf of their own interests, and B, to protect the overall global system of free market capital accumulation. What if, what if, from all of this, we concluded that US foreign policy is neither timid, as the conservatives say, nor foolish, as the liberals say, but is remarkably successful in rolling back just about all governments and social movements that attempted to serve popular needs rather than private corporate greed. Such an analysis, hurriedly sketched here, would take some effort to lay out and would amount to a Marxist critique, a correct critique of capitalist imperialism. Though Marxists are not the only ones that might arrive at it, it almost certainly would not be published anywhere except in a Marxist publication. We cross too many lines. Because we tried to explain the particular situation, child labor, in terms of a larger set of social relations, corporate class power, our presentation would be rejected out of hand as ideological. The perceptual taboos imposed by the dominant powers teach people to avoid thinking critically about such powers. In contrast, Marxism gets us into the habit of asking why, of seeing the linkage between political events and class power. A common method of devaluing Marxism is to misrepresent what it actually says, and then to attack the misrepresentation. This happens easily enough, since most of the anti-Marxist critics and their audiences have only a passing familiarity with Marxist literature, and rely instead on their own characterized notions. Thus, the Roman Catholic pastoral letter on Marxist communism rejects the claim that, quote, structural, read class, revolution can entirely cure a disease that is man himself, nor can it provide the solution of all human suffering, unquote. But who makes such a claim? There is no denying that revolution does not entirely cure all human suffering. But why is that assertion used as a refutation of Marxism? Most Marxists are neither Shellistic or utopian. They dream not of a perfect society, but of a better, more just life. They make no claim of eliminating all suffering, and recognize that even in the best of societies, there are the inevitable assaults of misfortune, mortality, and other vulnerabilities of life. And certainly in any society where there are some people who, for whatever reason, are given to wrongful deeds and self-serving corruptions. The highly imperfect nature of human beings should make us all the more determined not to see power and wealth accumulating in the hands of an unaccountable few, which is the central dedication of capitalism. Capitalism and its various institutions affect the most personal dimensions of everyday life in ways not readily evident. A Marxist approach helps us to see connections to which we were previously blind, to relate effects to causes, and to replace the arbitrary and the mysterious with the regular and the necessary. A Marxist perspective helps us to see injustice as rooted in systemic causes that go beyond individual choice, and to view crucial developments not as neutral happenings, but as intended consequences of class power and interest. Marxism also shows how even unintended consequences can be utilized by those with superior resources to service their interests. Is Marx still relevant today? Only if you want to know why the media distort the news in a mostly mainstream direction. Why more and more people at home and abroad face economic adversity while money continues to accumulate in the hands of relatively few. Why there is so much private wealth and public property in this country and elsewhere. why US forces find it necessary to intervene in so many regions of the world, why a rich and productive economy offers chronic recessions, underemployment, and neglect of social needs, and why many political office holders are unwilling or unable to serve the public interest. Some Marxist theorists have so ascended into the numbing altitudes of abstract cognition that they seldom touch political realities here on Earth. They spend their time talking to each other in self referential code, a scholastic ritual that Doug Dowd describes as, quote, how many Marxists can dance on the head of a surplus value? Fortunately, there are others who not only tell us about Marxist theory and demonstrate its utility, but demonstrate its utility by applying it to political actualities. They know how to draw connections between immediate experience and the larger structural forces that shape that experience. They cross the forbidden line and talk about class power. This is why, for all the misrepresentation and suppression, Marxist scholarship survives. While not having all the answers, it does have a superior explanatory power, telling us something about reality that bourgeois scholarship refuses to do. Marxism offers the kind of subversive truths that cause fear and trembling among the high and mighty, those who live atop a mountain of lies. That's our chapter.